Welcome to the Local Let Summary Invoice How To video. This video is to explain how to use the new Local Let Summary Invoice spreadsheet, which you'll notice looks somewhat similar to the old version. It looks a lot like what you're used to seeing, but it is going to be slightly different, and the inner workings of the spreadsheet are very different. So we wanted to create this how-to video to explain the math in the cell, how to use the cell, and just an overview to minimize the number of questions that you'll have as you start to use this spreadsheet. The first thing you'll notice is that the header information on this spreadsheet is identical to the old version. You have area for your project information to be entered, your contact information, signature block, date, as well as an area to indicate that whether or not this is when this is the final invoice. And then we're going to move down to the actual invoicing portion of the spreadsheet. This block is going to look similar to what you're used to seeing, with the colors being a little different and a little bit more information maybe than in the old version. But this is basically the area where the first funding source will be entered, and then it's duplicated for a second funding source here. And we'll walk through a specific example. But basically the way this is set up is so that you can have a project with multiple funding sources invoiced on the same spreadsheet and still have the math done for you. This should be able to take care of the vast majority of LPA projects. However, there will be some projects that are unique enough that this spreadsheet won't be able to be used. And so included in the spreadsheet is a tab of similar information, which is very simple math that can be used for unique projects. And this can just be manually changed to fit your needs. Moving back to this tab though, and scrolling to the bottom, you'll see another area that's similar to what was on the old spreadsheet but slightly different. Federal and state funds have been separated on this spreadsheet, and you're given cells to enter the maximum amounts for those funding sources. It's very important that this information gets entered into here before any numbers are entered into the spreadsheet up here, or else the equations aren't going to work and it's going to look like the spreadsheet's just the math is not working for you. You'll get a bunch of NAs and errors in the calculations. So the first thing you should do after entering your project information and reading the notes is to then come down here and enter your federal and state funding maximums and encumbered amounts. So you'll notice when you get into the spreadsheet, the first thing you should do is read these notes over here. There's a lot of directions in here, as well as just some overall information. And one of the things you'll see is that there's two different formats of cells in the invoicing portion of the spreadsheet. There's gray cells with orange text. These cells are the calculations, and you'll see it says don't edit. These cells are calculated for you, and in fact you can't edit them at the moment. They are locked so that the equations cannot be messed with or changed. And so you're going to instead look at these orange cells with the bluish font. These are the input cells. This is where you're going to enter information when applicable. So there'll be some that don't apply, like often SIB loans or bonds won't be in here. You can just delete that. But there'll be some cases in which it is there. So fill in the orange cells that are applicable, and you can leave the rest blank that aren't applicable. Okay, so you've come in here for the first time, you're ready to build an invoice, you've read your notes, you kind of understand how this works, and you're ready to try it out for the first time. You've of course watched this how-to video, I'm sure, so you are ready to go. The first thing to note when you're doing that is that I've duplicated some of these notes with comments here to give you just a little bit more direction than what's in the notes. So you can hover over each of these cells that has a little red triangle in the corner, and that means that there's a comment in there. So for this one it says enter federal SAC and description here. So you'll go in there and you can enter what's there, and it says for this gray cell that you can't edit, this cell should remain untouched for local portion of the project split. So read the comments along with the notes, fill in your encumbrance requests, put some of your detailed information in here. As I mentioned, you can leave cells blank that don't apply. So if you don't have a second funding source, this entire block will just be blank. You don't have to enter anything. You can just leave it as you see here, or you can go in and delete the orange cells that are in here. Very important, as I mentioned earlier, when you're setting this to be invoiced for the first time, you must enter your federal maximums as well as your encumbered amounts. So you've got your federal max here, your federal encumbered amount, your state funding maximum here, and your state encumbered amount. And these can be zero if they don't apply, but you must enter them here, or else the equations will not be able to calculate for you. The math requires that those caps be in there because it's set up so that it doesn't allow you to bill over the cap. It automatically puts that into this over the cap row, and we'll go through a specific example in a moment. But before we do, there's a little bit more to explain that would make this helpful and prevent some errors in the use of the spreadsheet. Within both funding sources, you'll see that there's a visual separation between the top 3 rows and the bottom 3 rows of the funding source. And the way it's set up is that the first 3 rows are some combination of federal, local, and state or TRC funds. I'll change this to state just so that you can see, but basically this can be any combination of federal, local, and state funds, but it's important that they're entered in the correct row. The first row can only be federal funds, and it's okay if it's 0, but you can only enter federal funds on the first row. The second row is only local funds, and again, it's okay if it's 0. It just has to be on the second row if it's local funds within the split. And then the third row is where the state, TRC, OPWC, or SIB loan being used as the local share gets entered. So you'll choose your type with this drop down, and it's limited to what is allowed in that row. So like you'll see in this second row, only local can be chosen, and that's because there's equations reading all of these cells, and if that's not the local funds in that row, the equations won't be giving you the right number. So the first row is limited to the federal funds, the second to local, and then the third you have an option between state and then TRC or OPWC. That brings us to the bottom 3 rows of the funding source. The fourth row, which is the first of the bottom 3, is for the over the cap local costs. So this would be what trickles over into your uncapped funding source. As soon as your total cost to date result in invoicing over the maximums, those dollar amounts will overflow into this LTAP over the cap row, and that will be done automatically for you. The fifth row is for 100% local items that were planned in the plans. Now you'll see that this is an input, it's not a calculation, and that's because in order for these equations to work, we have to manually input the dollar amount of planned 100% local items. So this might be maybe the local spec'd an item that they want that we approved and they're paying for it at their cost. That dollar amount would be entered into this cell here, and we'll go through, as I mentioned, we'll go through an actual example with dollar amounts, but I'm just sort of explaining what goes where. And then the last row is for if you have SIB or bonds. So these are far less common than everything else in the invoicing sheet, but if you have SIB or bonds that are being used not as the local fund, it's going to get entered on this row. So you're going to choose SIB or bond. You're going to make sure your encumbrance number's in here, and then there's a cell here to enter the percentage, but it's always 100 because this is getting billed outside of this split here. So you manually enter those dollar amounts as well. Okay, so let's look at an example. We're going to put $100 in for our federal max, but let's say that we've only encumbered $90 of that amount. And we don't have, as of right now, we've got it set up as an 80-20 local split, so we'll just leave it there. Let's pretend like we don't have any state funding at the moment, but the concept's the same if we do. So let's say that we've billed at $100, which will result in an 80-20 split. You'll see $80 federal, $20 local. We're still under the cap, so nothing's being added to this row, and the total amount due is $80. That's the federal and state portion, but in this case there's no state, so it's just the federal portion. But what happens if the total cost to date result in invoicing over the amount that we have encumbered? So let's say instead our total cost of data are $150. You'll see an alert popped up, but it's a yellow alert, so that doesn't mean that something's wrong. It's just letting you know something is happening. What's the alert say? Encumbered amount exceeded, overage added to over the cap row. So it's letting us know that, hey, we're capping these federal funds at the encumbered amount because we've exceeded it. The overage has been added to the local 100% row. So it's the over cap row. So it's just telling us, hey, we're capped at the encumbered amount. You've invoiced more than that. The 80-20 split remains 80-20 of the amount that allows for the full encumbered amount to be billed, and anything above and beyond that was added to the over the cap row. So you'll see that if you add these numbers up, they equal the 150 total, but that's because 3750 is being billed at a 100% local. So the federal / state amount due is the full encumbered amount. So you'll see it's doing the math for you. You don't have to figure out how much of that is over the cap so that you're billing only the $90. And then it's also a nice visual reference to tell you, hey, you're over the encumbered amount. If you still have room within the federal max, you're going to need to either encumber more funds, or maybe this is something that has to be at local funds. But anyway, it's just a visual alert letting you know, hey, you've exceeded the encumbered amount. So now that brings us to the fifth row, which I had mentioned were 100% local items that the local elected to pay for themselves. So items in this row would not come out of the federal split because it's something that the local is paying for above and beyond. So let's pretend that $50 worth of this invoice was items that the local elected to pay for themselves. You'll see that the federal and local portions are now $80 and $20, and there's no over the cap amount because we're only billing a total of $100 outside of the $50 that the local items accounted for. So now we're billing less than the encumbered amount. The encumbered amount is 90, but the federal portion is only 80. So the over the cap row was removed. All of the $100 is split between the federal and local, and then the elected dollar amount, the 100% locally chosen items, are added to this row manually. And the reason that this row is separate from the 100% local items that are over the cap is because in order for the spreadsheet to automatically calculate overages, we had to manually separate items that were elected by the LPA to be paid for at their costs. This allows the math to work out. So now we're on the fifth row of the first funding source, which is going to be used when you have either SIB or bond funds that are not being used as the local portion of the project. You'll see up in the notes right here, number 9, that if a SIB loan is being used for the local portion, you're instead going to enter it here on row 3 and choose state funding because that's mathematically how it will be treated. But this row is for when SIB or bonds are being used outside of that local portion of the split. So again, you're going to go in here and you're going to actually type SIB loan, and you're going to put in your SAC code for it. I guess it would be technically SAC and then SIB loan, and then make sure your encumbrance numbers in there, and then you're going to choose SIB for this line. Now that's just to let the finance department know what it is. Whether you choose SIB or bond is not going to affect any math, but you're going to choose SIB when it's SIB, and this will always be 100. It's just a text field here. It's not going to affect any math, but this basically is getting billed outside of the 80-20 split, so it's going to come from this total amount first. So as it stands now, we've got $50 in elected local funds, so that 50 is coming out of this 150, which means there's only $100 being split between federal and local. So let's pretend that actually that $100 is supposed to be from the SIB. When we put 100 in SIB, you'll see, boom, all the money's gone from the federal and local because the full amount of this invoice is made up for in the elected local items as well as the SIB loan. So you'll see that the total amount due is just the amount of the SIB loan. and there's nothing due from this federal and local split up here. So that is how you fill out your total cost to date and where you put corresponding dollar amounts. Please do remember that you're not just going to leave this information in the orange cells as you see here. Actually enter your SAC codes and your source in here, whether it's safety or whatnot. So make sure you put in your SAC codes. That helps finance a lot. Make sure you enter your encumbrance numbers. And then the other thing I didn't mention is that for every funding source that exists on the invoice, you must fill out the type and percentage. If there is federal funds on this invoice and you don't fill out both of these columns, the math will not work out properly. For example, let's pretend I do have that $100, but I delete the type and percentage. You'll see it's not invoicing that SIB money, even though it's there, and that's because the equations are looking for this information to properly separate it. For the SIB is the only case in which the percentage doesn't matter. This fifth row, every other one, if I get rid of this percentage, that won't properly invoice, and you'll see there's a red error telling me, hey, something's wrong. And what it's telling me here is that, hey, your funding percentages for the plan split do not add up to 100, so something's wrong. It doesn't make sense. So fill out all the stuff that you need to fill out for math to work. And finally, that takes us to our previous payments. So let's say this is instead invoice number 2, and there obviously were payments on invoice number 1. Those have to manually be entered into this column here. So let's pretend this $100 was actually paid on invoice number 1, and we're preparing to fill out invoice number 2. So I manually put in $100 here. You'll see that it's no longer billing for that SIB loan amount. So the only money being billed is the 50 in elected local items. Now be careful, because this is the one area in which you can enter false information and the spreadsheet doesn't know it, so it won't warn you. I can enter in that I previously paid $100 in federal funds and result in a negative number, and the spreadsheet doesn't know that. So be aware that the previous payments is the one area in which you can really screw it up without being alerted about it. But in order for the equations not to be a mile long, previous payments need to be manual entries. And that brings us to the conclusion of this how-to video. Just remember, when you hop in for the first time, read through the notes and make sure that you get an understanding of how everything works. There is some things mentioned that I didn't specifically call out because, there's a very large number of possibilities that you could be invoicing for, and this spreadsheet should cover the vast majority of them. But in order to keep this video at a reasonable length, I didn't go through every scenario, but the concepts are all the same as the fake example that I walked you through with each of these cells. Funding source number 2 is just a duplicate of number 1. All the math is the same, so you should be able to do everything I did with number 1 in number 2, so that you can pull from 2 sources at the same time and still have the math done for you. Just to remind you, there is an unlocked tab in here for very unique projects that might not be able to fit within what's restricted on the first tab. This tab is protected, although I did include the password to unprotect it. So just be careful, because if you unprotect the sheet and mess the equations up, it's going to be near impossible to figure out what you did without spending numerous hours. It would probably be easier just to start from scratch if that happens. So and one more thing I wanted to reiterate, all of these notes and the prompts that pop up when something is wrong or you're just being alerted, they are outside the printable area. So if I press Control P, I can see a little preview of how it would look when it prints, and it's just like you're used to seeing. Make sure the LPA puts their letterhead on it, and that is all I have for you. Thank you guys, and I hope you find this spreadsheet useful.